Medieval people did not wake up every morning feeling oppressed. They did not think of themselves as controlled. They did not feel trapped. And that is exactly why the control worked. No guards followed them through the streets. No constant commands were shouted in their ears. No visible chains defined their lives. Instead, control lived in habits, routines, expectations, and rules so familiar that questioning them felt unnecessary, even impossible. From birth, medieval people learned where they belonged, what they were allowed to want, how far they could move, and how much they could change. These limits were not enforced daily with force. They were enforced quietly, through tradition, obligation, and fear of standing out. Most people never tried to escape this system, not because escape was impossible, but because the idea of escape rarely formed in the first place. They believed their lives were natural. They believed their roles were fixed. They believed the world simply worked this way. In this video, we're not talking about kings, laws, or punishments. We're talking about something more powerful. A system of control so complete that the people living inside it did not recognize it as control at all. Stay until the end, because once you see how this system worked, you'll realize something unsettling. It didn't disappear with the Middle Ages. And if you enjoy deep, quiet history that reveals how ordinary lives were shaped without people noticing, like, subscribe, and leave a comment, because the next chapter will change how you see freedom itself. Control in medieval life did not begin with rules written on parchment or commands issued by authority. It began earlier, before memory formed clearly, before comparison was possible, before a person learned that life could be structured differently. By the time a medieval individual was old enough to question the world, the shape of that world had already been absorbed so deeply that questioning it felt unnatural. From birth, a medieval child entered a system that did not need explanation. The world arrived already organized. There was a place to sleep, a place to work, a place to stand, and a place to remain silent. None of these were presented as choices. They were simply there, reinforced daily by repetition rather than force. The earliest lessons were not spoken. They were observed. A child watched adults wake at the same hour every day, follow the same paths, perform the same motions, return to the same spaces. These repetitions created a sense of inevitability. Life did not appear flexible. It appeared patterned. No one explained why things were done this way. Explanation implies alternative. Medieval life avoided alternatives by avoiding explanation. Children were told how to do things long before they were ever allowed to ask why. And when they did ask why, the answer was rarely detailed. It was usually some version of "this is how it is done." This phrase carried immense power. It closed the door to imagination quietly. It taught that the structure of life was inherited, not constructed. That questioning was unnecessary because the world had already decided. Control embedded itself in time first. Days followed predictable rhythms that were not chosen by individuals. Work began when light allowed it. Rest arrived when exhaustion demanded it. Meals occurred when they could, not when desired. Over time, the body learned to align itself with these rhythms automatically. Wanting something outside them felt wrong, even before it felt impossible. Then control embedded itself in space. Movement was limited not by walls, but by expectation. A child learned which areas were theirs and which were not, which paths were familiar and which were avoided, which buildings were entered freely and which were approached with hesitation. These boundaries were rarely marked physically. They were marked socially. Children noticed that certain people moved freely while others did not. They noticed that voices lowered in some places and rose in others. They noticed which gestures brought approval and which brought correction. Through observation alone, they learned how far they were allowed to exist. Correction did not need to be harsh. A look, a pause, a withheld response was enough. Medieval communities were small enough that social feedback was constant. Approval felt necessary. Disapproval felt dangerous. Children learned quickly which behaviors maintained harmony and which disrupted it. Education reinforced this without formal instruction. Most medieval people did not receive abstract teaching about society. They received training through participation. Work was introduced early, not as exploitation, but as belonging. To contribute was to be part of the group. To resist contribution was to risk exclusion. This framing mattered deeply. Control did not feel like restriction. It felt like responsibility. Responsibility felt like maturity. And maturity felt desirable. By the time a child grew into adolescence, Their sense of self was already aligned with the system. They did not see themselves as individuals choosing roles. They saw themselves as fulfilling roles that had always existed. Identity was not discovered. It was inherited. The idea of a different life rarely formed clearly. Comparison requires exposure. Medieval life limited exposure effectively. Most people lived and died within a narrow geographic range. Stories of elsewhere existed, but they were abstract, exaggerated, or cautionary. They did not function as viable alternatives. Even imagination was shaped by repetition. Stories reinforced familiar hierarchies. Traditions repeated known patterns. Celebrations reaffirmed structure rather than challenged it. Change appeared as anomaly rather than possibility. Control also embedded itself in the body. Posture, gesture, tone of voice, all were regulated subtly. Children learned how to stand, how to speak, when to look down, when to remain still. These behaviors became automatic. The body responded before the mind had time to question. This bodily conditioning was crucial. Once control lived in muscle memory, it no longer needed enforcement. People complied with expectations without conscious decision. Deviation felt uncomfortable physically, not just socially. Fear played a role, but it was not constant terror. It was low-level awareness. Awareness that standing out attracted attention. That attention invited consequence. Consequence did not always mean punishment. It could mean gossip, loss of trust, exclusion from opportunity. These were enough. What made this system so effective was its invisibility. No single person enforced it. No single rule defined it. It existed as a shared understanding, reinforced collectively. Everyone participated in maintaining it because everyone depended on it for stability. Parents did not see themselves as agents of control. They believed they were preparing children for reality. Elders did not see themselves as gatekeepers. They believed they were preserving order. The system persisted not because people were cruel, but because they were convinced it was necessary. By adulthood, most medieval people could not clearly articulate the limits placed on them. Those limits felt like common sense. They did not feel imposed. They felt natural. This is the most unsettling aspect of medieval control. It did not rely on constant enforcement. It relied on early alignment. By shaping perception before critical thought developed, it ensured that most people never experienced their lives as constrained. They experienced them as normal. And when control feels normal, it becomes nearly impossible to see. As medieval people moved out of childhood and into adult life, the control that had been absorbed silently did not weaken. It deepened. What had once been learned through observation and correction now became self-enforcement. By this stage, no one needed to tell a person how to behave. They already knew. More importantly, they felt when something was wrong long before they could explain why. Adulthood did not arrive as a moment of freedom. It arrived as responsibility. And responsibility was one of the most effective tools of control ever created. Once a person was responsible for work, for family, for reputation, for survival, questioning the structure that supported those responsibilities became dangerous. Doubt threatened stability. Stability meant survival. Work dominated daily existence. It was repetitive, predictable, and demanding. The rhythm of labor shaped thought itself. When days are filled with necessary tasks that must be repeated tomorrow regardless of how today feels, the mind learns not to wander far. Reflection becomes impractical. Speculation becomes indulgent. Thought narrows toward what must be done next. This narrowing was not experienced as loss. It felt like maturity. A person who focused only on what mattered was seen as reliable. Reliability was rewarded with trust, opportunity, and social acceptance. Those who seemed distracted by abstract questions were viewed as irresponsible or strange. Habit became the backbone of adult life. People woke, worked, ate, and rested in patterns so fixed that deviation felt uncomfortable even when no one objected. These habits were not chosen deliberately. They were inherited and reinforced daily. Over time, habit replaced decision. Fear reinforced this quietly. Not fear of punishment alone, but fear of instability. Medieval life balanced on fragile systems. A poor harvest, an injury, a broken relationship could threaten survival. Anything that disrupted order felt dangerous. Questioning order felt reckless. Community pressure intensified this effect. Medieval communities were intimate. Everyone knew everyone else's behavior. Reputation mattered constantly. Approval was not abstract. It affected access to work, cooperation, and protection. Standing out invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited risk. As adults, people learned how to monitor themselves. They corrected their own behavior before others needed to. They adjusted tone, posture, and expression automatically. This self-regulation reduced conflict and preserved harmony, but it also eliminated dissent before it could form. Language itself reinforced control. Vocabulary for alternatives was limited. There were words for duty, obligation, honor, and order. There were fewer words for personal desire as an independent concept. When a thing cannot be named clearly, it cannot be examined easily. Time reinforced acceptance. Years passed in repetition. Life unfolded predictably. The absence of change made the existing structure feel eternal. What had always been felt like what would always be. Imagining a different future felt unrealistic, almost childish. Stories and traditions reinforced this worldview. Tales emphasized roles rather than choices. They celebrated endurance, loyalty, and acceptance. Those who deviated were portrayed as foolish or disruptive. These narratives shaped expectations subtly but effectively. Even moments of dissatisfaction were absorbed by the system. Hardship was framed as normal. Fatigue was expected. Discomfort was shared. Suffering did not prompt rebellion because it was not interpreted as injustice. It was interpreted as life. This interpretation mattered deeply. Control works best when discomfort is normalized rather than explained. If hardship has no clear cause, it cannot be challenged. Medieval people did not see their struggles as the result of a system. They saw them as the result of existence itself. As adults aged, this perspective hardened further. Survival through repetition reinforced belief. If a person had lived decades within the same structure, questioning it late in life felt pointless. Change seemed unlikely. Endurance felt proven. Social roles became identity. A person did not think of themselves as someone temporarily performing a task. They were that role. That role defined their value. Losing it meant losing self. This made questioning the system psychologically threatening. Marriage, family, and community obligations reinforced this identity further. Others depended on one's compliance. Responsibility extended beyond self. Risking stability affected loved ones. This emotional weight discouraged deviation more effectively than force ever could. What made this control nearly invisible was its collective nature. No single authority imposed it daily. Everyone participated. Everyone reinforced it. Everyone believed they were simply doing what was necessary. Occasional moments of awareness did occur. People sometimes sensed that life felt narrow, that choices felt limited. But these thoughts lacked structure. There was no framework to hold them. Without language or example, awareness dissolved back into routine. Those who expressed dissatisfaction openly were not usually punished harshly. They were dismissed, labeled unrealistic, treated as naive. This social response discouraged others from articulating similar thoughts. Over time, the very idea of questioning life's structure felt strange. Not forbidden, just irrelevant. The question, could this be different, rarely formed fully enough to demand an answer. This is why medieval control was so complete. It did not require constant enforcement. It relied on internalization. People became guardians of the very system that constrained them. They did not feel watched. They felt normal. They did not feel controlled. They felt responsible. They did not feel trapped. They felt settled. And because control felt like common sense rather than coercion, it endured across generations without resistance. This is the most unsettling truth of medieval life. Most people did not know their lives were being controlled because the control had shaped what knowing itself meant. Daily life in the medieval world was the most powerful instrument of control precisely because it appeared ordinary. There were no grand declarations, no visible mechanisms announcing authority at every step. Control did not arrive as interruption. It arrived as routine. And routine, once accepted, became invisible. A medieval day began not with choice, but with necessity. People woke when light allowed them to see their work, not because they preferred it, but because deviation served no purpose. The body learned this rhythm early. Over time, waking earlier or later felt physically wrong. Control had already entered the nervous system. Work dominated the structure of the day, not in dramatic bursts, but in long, continuous stretches of effort that left little mental space unoccupied. The nature of this work mattered. It was repetitive, predictable, necessary. It trained the body to perform without reflection. Repetition dulled the impulse to question. When tomorrow promised the same tasks, asking why felt irrelevant. The medieval mind did not lack intelligence. It lacked unused attention. Survival required constant engagement. Hands were busy. Eyes were alert. Energy was rationed. Thought followed function. Anything that did not serve immediate survival or social stability felt indulgent. Time itself became a tool of control. Medieval people did not experience time as flexible or personal. Time belonged to the environment. Seasons dictated labor. Daylight dictated activity. The calendar was not a planner. It was a constraint. People did not decide when to work. They responded to when work was possible. Because time was external, people learned to surrender internal pacing. Desire did not alter schedules. Fatigue did not cancel obligations. This taught an early lesson. The world did not adjust to the individual. The individual adjusted to the world. Meals reinforced this further. Eating happened when food was available, not when hunger appeared. Hunger became something to endure quietly. This taught restraint at the most basic level. Desire was acknowledged but not obeyed. Over time, this extended beyond food into other areas of life. Movement was similarly regulated. Most people traveled the same routes every day, to fields, to workshops, to communal spaces. These paths were not chosen. They were inherited. Deviation was noticeable. Noticeability carried risk. Familiar routes felt safe not because they were safer, but because they were expected. Even rest was controlled. Rest occurred when exhaustion made work impossible, not when the body requested it. Sleep arrived as collapse rather than recovery. This framed rest as a necessity rather than a right. Something earned, not guaranteed. Because daily life was exhausting, emotional expression narrowed. There was little energy for sustained frustration or rebellion. Irritation passed quickly because holding it was costly. Anger was suppressed not through fear alone, but through fatigue. Community life reinforced conformity constantly. Everyone worked. Everyone watched. Everyone knew who was reliable and who was not. Reliability was currency. A reliable person was trusted. An unreliable one became vulnerable. This pressure required no enforcement. It operated automatically. Customs and traditions filled the gaps where logic might have challenged structure. People did things because they had always been done. Tradition removed the need for explanation. Explanation creates space for doubt. Tradition closed that space. Even celebrations reinforced control. They appeared as breaks from routine, but they followed strict patterns. They did not challenge order. They reaffirmed it. Roles remained visible. Hierarchies were displayed. Participation was expected. Deviance stood out. Language reflected this mindset. People spoke of duty, obligation, place, and role far more than desire or ambition. Personal longing existed, but it lacked vocabulary. Without language, desire remained vague and unorganized. Children absorbed this environment effortlessly. They did not need to be taught obedience explicitly. They learned it by participating. By the time they were old enough to imagine alternatives, those alternatives felt unrealistic. Importantly, this control did not feel oppressive because it was shared. Everyone was subject to the same rhythms. Shared hardship created solidarity, not rebellion. If everyone endured, endurance felt normal. Occasional dissatisfaction did arise. People felt tired. They felt constrained. But these feelings lacked a clear target. There was no single authority to blame. No obvious lever to pull. Discomfort dissolved into acceptance. Work identity became personal identity. A person was not someone who did work. They were their work. This made questioning the system existentially threatening. To reject the structure was to reject oneself. Over time, people internalized limits so completely that external enforcement became rare. The system no longer needed to punish. People corrected themselves. They adjusted behavior automatically. This is what makes medieval control so difficult to see from a modern perspective. There was no constant violence required. No daily reminder of authority. The system ran on habit, exhaustion, and shared belief. Control succeeded because it aligned with survival. To resist it felt like risking everything for nothing concrete. Most people chose stability, not because they were incapable of imagining more, but because imagining more offered no safe path forward. By the end of adulthood, the structure of daily life felt natural. Not imposed, not artificial, simply the way the world worked. And when a system reaches that level of acceptance, it no longer needs to announce itself. It has already won. As daily routines solidified in medieval life, fear did not disappear. It simply transformed. It stopped appearing as open threat and became something far more effective: the fear of disruption. Not the fear of immediate punishment, but the fear of standing out, of being noticed, of becoming unreliable in a world where reliability was essential for survival. This fear rarely needed to be spoken. It lived in observation. People watched what happened when someone deviated, even slightly. Not rebellion, not defiance, just difference. Someone who questioned customs too often. Someone who ignored a shared rhythm. Someone who acted out of sequence. The response was almost never dramatic. Opportunities quietly narrowed. Cooperation weakened. Trust thinned. Nothing violent was required. Customs and traditions became powerful tools of control precisely because they demanded no explanation. They were followed because they had always been followed. In medieval life, this mattered deeply. Asking for reasons implied doubt. Doubt implied instability. Instability threatened survival. Rituals divided life into accepted segments. When to work, when to rest, when to speak, when to remain silent. These divisions rarely matched personal feeling, but they matched the external order. Over time, external order took priority over internal experience. Fear deepened here. To step outside custom was not merely to behave differently. It was to appear dangerous to the community. In small medieval societies, being seen as a potential disruption was one of the most serious risks a person could take. Communities were small. Behavior was visible. Memory was long. Under these conditions, people did not feel constantly watched. They simply learned to remain aligned. Alignment became automatic. Questioning faded slowly. Not because people were incapable of asking questions, but because questions offered no practical benefit. Why is it this way? Had no actionable answer. Without answers, questions became liabilities, and liabilities were avoided. Habit narrowed the mind. Repeating the same actions every day did not expand thought. It stabilized it. Stability was ideal for the system. People still thought, but only within permitted boundaries. Their choices existed, but only among approved options. Fear never said be afraid. It said do not risk. Do not attract attention. Do not separate yourself. These warnings made life safer in the short term, but narrower over time. Years passed, and the narrowing became invisible. People imagined less, compared less, considered fewer alternatives. This was not enforced. It was normalized. Custom entered the body. How to stand, where to look, when to speak. These behaviors became reflexive. Control no longer needed to operate at the level of thought. It lived in posture, gesture, timing. When control enters the body, resistance becomes almost impossible. A person does not feel restrained. They feel incorrect when they deviate. This is why medieval people did not experience their lives as controlled. They experienced them as proper. And proper is the most powerful form of obedience. The system was not cruel. It was efficient. It did not break people. It shaped them. Shaped people do not resist. Most importantly, this shaping was not the result of a conscious decision. It was the outcome of years of repetition. People did not stop questioning because they were forced to. They stopped because questioning itself became strange. Daily life, work, custom, fear of disruption, and constant visibility slowly removed the habit of asking why. Control did not arrive as command. It arrived as normality. And normality became the deepest prison of all. Movement in medieval life appeared free on the surface. People walked the roads. They traveled between villages. They entered towns, fields, and marketplaces. From a distance, nothing suggested confinement. And yet, movement was one of the most quietly regulated aspects of medieval existence. Not through walls alone, but through expectation, habit, and consequence. From childhood, people learned where they belonged spatially, not as an abstract idea, but as a physical reality reinforced every day. Certain places felt familiar. Others felt distant even if they were nearby. This sense of belonging was not taught explicitly. It was absorbed through repetition. A child followed adults along the same paths, stood in the same places, avoided the same spaces. Over time, the body learned geography as permission. Paths mattered more than destinations. Most medieval people traveled along the same routes daily, from home to field, from workshop to well, from dwelling to communal space. These paths became ingrained physically. Feet followed them without thought. Deviating felt uncomfortable, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unfamiliar. Unfamiliarity carried risk. Not always immediate danger, but social visibility. Someone walking where they were not usually seen attracted attention. Attention raised questions. Questions created friction. In a small community, friction was dangerous. It threatened cooperation, trust, and access to shared resources. As a result, people learned to limit their movement voluntarily, not because they were ordered to stay in place, but because staying within known boundaries minimized risk. This self-limitation became habit. Habit became instinct. Villages and towns were structured to reinforce this. Layouts were irregular, winding, and intimate. Streets did not encourage wandering. They encouraged familiarity. Short distances connected known points. Large open spaces were rare and purposeful. The environment itself discouraged aimless movement. Even when larger towns offered more space, movement within them was socially segmented. Certain streets belonged to certain trades. Certain areas were associated with certain activities. People learned these associations early. Entering the wrong space felt intrusive. Not illegal, but inappropriate. This sense of "not for me" was powerful. It did not require enforcement. It lived in discomfort. Medieval people did not need signs to tell them where they belonged. Their bodies already knew. Travel beyond the immediate area was possible, but rare. Distance magnified risk exponentially. Leaving familiar territory meant losing the invisible protections of reputation, routine, and recognition. Outside one's home area, a person became undefined. Undefined meant vulnerable. Most people lacked a reason strong enough to justify this vulnerability. Survival depended on networks of mutual dependence. Leaving those networks was not an adventure. It was a gamble. Roads themselves reinforced this psychology. Medieval roads were not designed for ease. They were narrow, uneven, and slow. Travel took time, energy, and resources. The cost of movement was high. This naturally discouraged unnecessary travel. But more importantly, roads were social spaces. Travelers were visible. Being seen moving frequently raised questions. Why were you leaving? Where were you going? What were you avoiding? Movement itself became a statement. Because of this, stillness was associated with reliability. A person who stayed in place was predictable. Predictability was valuable. A person who moved often was unpredictable. Unpredictability was risky. Over time, this association reshaped identity. People came to see themselves as belonging to a specific place rather than existing within a broader landscape. Where you are became part of who you are. Movement threatened that identity. Physical boundaries reinforced mental ones. Walls, gates, fields, and natural features marked edges. But these edges mattered less as barriers and more as signals. They told people where familiarity ended and uncertainty began. Crossing these edges did not feel like freedom. It felt like exposure. Children learned this early. They were allowed to roam only within defined areas. Venturing beyond invited correction. Not always punishment, but concern. Concern communicated danger. Over time, the boundary moved inward. Children internalized limits long before they could articulate them. Even imagination was shaped by these boundaries. People imagined their lives within known spaces. Futures were envisioned locally. Ambition rarely involved relocation. Change was imagined as alteration of role, not of place. This spatial control worked because it aligned with survival. Staying close to home maximized access to support. Familiarity reduced uncertainty. Movement increased risk. The rational choice was to stay. Importantly, no one experienced this as confinement. Medieval people did not wake up wishing to roam endlessly. They woke up needing to survive the day. The idea of unrestricted movement held little appeal when movement carried cost. Over generations, this produced a population that was geographically static not because of force, but because of conditioning. The land did not need to imprison people. People learned to remain where they were. The rare individuals who moved frequently were viewed with suspicion. Travelers, messengers, and outsiders existed, but they were exceptions. Their mobility marked them as different. Difference invited caution. This caution reinforced the belief that staying put was safer, wiser, and more respectable. The system rewarded those who remained within bounds and subtly punished those who did not. What made this control especially effective was that it did not eliminate movement entirely. It allowed enough mobility to appear free, while discouraging enough to remain stable. The illusion of choice masked the reality of constraint. Medieval people believed they could leave if they truly needed to. This belief was rarely tested, and when it was, the cost often confirmed the lesson. Movement was expensive. Space also shaped social interaction. Where one could stand, sit, or speak mattered. Physical positioning reflected hierarchy. People learned instinctively where they belonged in a room, a street, or a gathering. Standing in the wrong place felt immediately wrong. This bodily awareness reinforced obedience. When the body learns its place, the mind follows. Over time, physical boundaries became psychological boundaries. People stopped imagining themselves elsewhere. They stopped seeing space as something to explore. It became something to navigate safely within known limits. This is how movement became control, not through restriction, but through cost. Not through walls, but through habit. Not through command, but through comfort with the familiar. Medieval people did not feel trapped because they did not imagine the trap. Their world felt complete because it was all they needed to survive. And survival shaped perception more powerfully than freedom ever could. By controlling movement quietly, medieval life controlled thought. The mind does not wander far when the body does not. And this is why medieval people did not know their lives were being controlled. The control was built into the ground beneath their feet. As physical movement became quietly limited through habit and cost, another layer of control settled into medieval life: invisible borders. These were not always marked by walls or guards. Often, they existed only in shared understanding. And because they were shared, they rarely needed enforcement. A medieval person lived inside multiple borders at once. Some were visible, like town gates or field boundaries. Others were invisible but more powerful: legal jurisdiction, custom, obligation, and reputation. Crossing these borders was not impossible, but it was never neutral. Each crossing carried consequence. Law played a subtle role here. Medieval law was not experienced as a distant system applied equally everywhere. It was local, personal, and uneven. People knew which rules applied to them and which did not. More importantly, they knew where protection ended. Leaving one jurisdiction often meant leaving legal recognition. A person was known somewhere. Outside that place, they were unknown. Unknown meant unprotected. This knowledge discouraged movement more effectively than force. Safety existed where identity was recognized. This created psychological borders long before physical ones were reached. A person did not need to see a gate to feel the edge of their world. They felt it when familiarity thinned, when faces changed, when names no longer carried meaning. Custom reinforced these borders. Customs were local. What was acceptable in one place was suspicious in another. Speech, gesture, dress, and behavior signaled belonging. A misstep marked someone as an outsider immediately. Outsider status invited caution at best, hostility at worst. Because of this, people learned to stay where they could read the rules without thinking. Familiarity reduced risk. Unfamiliarity multiplied it. This calculation happened automatically. It did not require conscious fear. It required only memory. Borders also existed within communities. Certain spaces were appropriate only for certain people. Workshops, meeting areas, storage places, and communal zones carried expectations. Entering the wrong space felt wrong even if nothing stopped you physically. This internal sense of boundary was powerful. It meant that control did not need guards. People policed themselves spatially. They avoided places where they did not belong. Belonging was not defined abstractly. It was felt in the body as comfort or discomfort. Even time acted as a border. Certain spaces were acceptable only at certain hours. A place that felt neutral during the day felt risky at night. Movement outside expected times attracted attention. Attention created explanation. Explanation created vulnerability. Law reinforced this indirectly, not through constant punishment, but through uncertainty. Medieval justice was inconsistent by modern standards. Outcomes varied. This unpredictability discouraged testing limits. When consequences are unclear, avoidance feels safer than resistance. Most people did not know the full extent of the law. They did not need to. They only needed to know where they were safe. Safety zones were learned through experience, observation, and stories. Stories mattered greatly. They mapped invisible borders in the mind. Stories of what happened to those who crossed lines circulated quietly. Not dramatic tales of rebellion, but practical warnings. Someone went too far. Someone spoke in the wrong place. Someone traveled without protection. These stories did not inspire resistance. They inspired caution. Borders also formed through obligation. A person's role tied them to place. Leaving meant abandoning duties. Duties were moral as much as practical. Abandoning them threatened reputation. Reputation mattered because it shaped survival. This moral framing made borders feel ethical rather than restrictive. Staying was not just safer. It was right. Leaving felt selfish. Even imagining departure carried guilt. Over time, these layers fused. Physical space, legal recognition, custom, obligation, and reputation aligned. Together, they created a world that felt whole and complete. There was no obvious outside to long for. This completeness was deceptive. It masked constraint as coherence. Because life fit together tightly, questioning any part of it felt destabilizing. Pulling one thread threatened the whole fabric. Children absorbed this intuitively. They learned where they could go, when they could go there, and with whom. These lessons were rarely explained. They were enforced through tone, reaction, and correction. By adulthood, borders lived in muscle memory. The effectiveness of this system lay in its subtlety. No single border felt oppressive. Each felt reasonable. Together, they eliminated meaningful choice without announcing its absence. From a modern perspective, it appears as confinement. From within, it felt like order. Order promised predictability. Predictability promised survival. Survival outweighed freedom. Importantly, medieval people did not feel deprived of movement because movement itself was not valued as an abstract good. Stability was valued. Continuity was valued. Movement was tolerated only when it served those values. Those who crossed borders successfully usually did so with support, official roles, trade connections, protection, or necessity. Their movement reinforced the idea that only certain people should move freely. This strengthened the system further. The presence of walls, gates, and checkpoints did not create control on their own. They symbolized it. The real control existed long before a person reached them. It existed in expectation. By the time someone encountered a physical border, the decision had already been made internally. Crossing it felt risky, unnecessary, or wrong. Most turned back long before reaching that point. This is how medieval control achieved durability. It did not rely on constant enforcement. It relied on internal limits reinforced by environment, law, custom, and fear of uncertainty. People did not know their lives were being controlled because they did not experience control as an external force. They experienced it as common sense. The borders of medieval life were not lines on a map. They were lines in the mind. And once borders exist in the mind, they no longer need walls. Time in medieval life did not belong to the individual. This single fact shaped everything else. People did not experience time as something they could manage, optimize, or even meaningfully negotiate with. Time arrived already structured, already claimed, already spoken for. The future was not a space of possibility. It was a schedule waiting to be fulfilled. From early childhood, people learned that time moved independently of desire. The day began when light allowed work. It ended when the body could no longer continue. This rhythm was not chosen. It was accepted. Over years, the body internalized it so deeply that deviation felt unnatural rather than liberating. Seasons reinforced this control relentlessly. Each season arrived with demands that could not be postponed. Planting could not wait for readiness. Harvest could not wait for comfort. Weather dictated urgency. Missed timing meant loss, not inconvenience. This taught a powerful lesson. The future did not adapt to the individual. The individual adapted to the future. Because of this, planning was practical rather than aspirational. People did not imagine radically different futures. They prepared for known cycles. Next winter, next planting, next obligation. The future was not open-ended. It was repetitive. This repetition trained acceptance. If the next year looked like the last, then questioning the structure felt pointless. Improvement meant surviving more efficiently, not transforming circumstances. Ambition narrowed accordingly. Daily obligations filled every gap. Work did not simply occupy time. It defined it. A day without work was not freedom. It was danger. Idleness threatened survival, reputation, and belonging. This association made busyness virtuous and rest suspicious. Even rest was controlled by obligation. Rest happened only when exhaustion forced it. It was not scheduled. It was not protected. This framed rest as weakness rather than necessity. People learned to endure fatigue quietly rather than expect recovery. Communal time reinforced this further. Bells, calls, and shared routines signaled when activities should begin and end. These signals were not suggestions. They were markers of belonging. Responding correctly meant alignment. Ignoring them meant difference. Difference attracted attention. Attention invited explanation. Explanation created vulnerability. Over time, people learned to align their internal sense of time with external signals automatically. Obligation also extended into the future through expectation. A person's role came with assumed continuity. You would do tomorrow what you did today. You would fulfill the same duties next year. Breaking this expectation required justification. Justification carried risk. Marriage, family, and community ties locked time even more tightly. Responsibilities multiplied. Others depended on you. The cost of deviation increased. Choosing differently did not affect only you. It affected those bound to you. This collective dependence made time moral. Fulfilling obligations was not just practical, it was right. Failing to do so was not just inefficient, it was wrong. Moral framing is one of the strongest forms of control because it operates internally. Even imagination was shaped by this structure. People imagined their futures as extensions of their present roles. A child imagined becoming what adults around them already were. Novel futures lacked reference points. Without reference, imagination remained vague. Stories reinforced this temporal confinement. Tales emphasized endurance, patience, and acceptance. Change was portrayed as disruption. Stability was portrayed as virtue. These narratives trained people to see the future as something to endure rather than design. Law and custom reinforced temporal obligations subtly. Contracts, duties, and expectations extended indefinitely. Leaving a role was not simply a personal choice. It required resolution, permission, or replacement. These barriers discouraged change. Time pressure also limited reflection. Long hours of labor left little mental space unused. When the body is tired and the next task is urgent, abstract thought feels indulgent. Questioning becomes inefficient. Over years, this created a population that lived almost entirely in the present cycle, with little psychological distance from obligation. The future felt heavy, not hopeful. It was something approaching, not something open. Importantly, people did not feel rushed constantly. They felt aligned. Alignment masked coercion. When your internal rhythm matches the external demand, control feels natural. Moments of dissatisfaction occurred, but they lacked direction. People felt tired, constrained, frustrated. But these feelings had no clear cause. They were attributed to life itself, not to a system. This attribution mattered deeply. If hardship is seen as natural, it cannot be challenged. Medieval life framed difficulty as inevitable. The future was not expected to improve. It was expected to continue. As people aged, this expectation hardened. Having endured decades of repetition, the idea of radical change felt unrealistic. The future narrowed further. Planning shrank to maintaining stability. Children absorbed this quietly. They learned not to ask what they wanted to be, but what they would be. The difference is subtle but decisive. One implies choice. Will implies inevitability. Time, obligation, and expectation fused into a single structure. Together, they shaped behavior without needing force. People did what they were supposed to do because the future demanded it. This is why medieval people did not feel controlled by time. They felt guided by it. Guidance feels safer than command. The system did not need to threaten. It only needed to remind. Remind of seasons, of duties, of tomorrow. And tomorrow always looked the same. This is how the future itself became a tool of control, not through fear of what might happen, but through certainty of what would. When the future contains no genuine alternatives, the present feels unavoidable. And when life feels unavoidable, control becomes invisible. As time and obligation shaped the present and narrowed the future, another layer of control settled quietly into medieval life: expectation. Expectation did not arrive as a rule. It arrived as assumption. What people expected from themselves and what others expected from them formed invisible boundaries that were often stronger than law. From early adulthood, a medieval person learned that life followed a predictable arc. Childhood led to labor. Labor led to responsibility. Responsibility led to endurance. This progression was not discussed as a choice. It was presented as maturity. To resist, it was not rebellious. It was childish. Promises played a crucial role in this structure. Promises were rarely formal, but they were everywhere. A person promised consistency simply by occupying a role. A worker promised to work. A parent promised to provide. A neighbor promised cooperation. These promises were not spoken once and fulfilled. They were renewed daily through repetition. Breaking a promise did not always require explicit failure. Changing direction was enough. Choosing differently could be interpreted as abandonment. Abandonment carried moral weight. It suggested unreliability. In a fragile system, unreliability was dangerous. Because of this, people learned to protect their reputations carefully. Reputation was not about virtue alone. It was about predictability. A predictable person could be depended upon. Dependence was survival. Hope itself became regulated through this lens. Hope was permitted only within accepted boundaries. Hoping for a better harvest was acceptable. Hoping for a different life was not. The difference was subtle but decisive. People learned to hope for continuity rather than transformation. Improvement meant doing the same thing slightly better, not doing something different. This constrained ambition quietly. Language reinforced this limitation. People spoke of patience, endurance, and acceptance far more than change or reinvention. These words shaped expectation. When the language of possibility is limited, imagination follows. Social reinforcement was constant. When someone expressed dissatisfaction that pointed beyond acceptable hope, the response was not confrontation. It was redirection. Advice focused on coping, not change. Endure. Wait. Accept. These responses did not silence people aggressively. They absorbed dissent gently. Over time, expressing certain hopes felt inappropriate. Not forbidden, but unrealistic. People learned to censor themselves before others needed to. This self-censorship preserved harmony, but it also preserved the system. Obligation extended into the future through inheritance of expectation. Children were not asked what they wanted. They were prepared for what they were expected to become. Preparation framed inevitability as care. This framing was powerful. When expectation is presented as concern for one's future, resisting it feels ungrateful. Gratitude replaced autonomy. Obligation deepened. Even moments of success reinforced control. Praise rewarded alignment, not deviation. A person who fulfilled expectations was celebrated. A person who exceeded them in unconventional ways was viewed with suspicion. Failure also reinforced the system. When people struggled, the explanation was personal inadequacy, not structural constraint. This internalized blame prevented systemic questioning. Over decades, this produced a population that managed hope carefully. Too much hope invited disappointment. Too little invited despair. The acceptable range was narrow. Within that range, life continued. People did not feel hopeless. They felt realistic. Realism, in this context, meant accepting limitation as wisdom. Expectation also structured memory. People remembered life as a series of fulfilled duties rather than chosen moments. Looking back, endurance felt like accomplishment. This retrospective validation discouraged future questioning. Importantly, medieval control did not eliminate desire. It redirected it. Desire focused inward, toward being a good worker, a good parent, a good member of the community. External transformation was replaced by internal adequacy. This redirection stabilized society effectively. People competed quietly to fulfill roles better rather than challenge the roles themselves. Energy flowed into maintenance rather than change. Over time, hope became indistinguishable from patience. Waiting replaced wanting. This was not taught explicitly. It emerged naturally from repetition. When hope is limited to what already exists, the future becomes an extension of the present. When the future holds no genuine alternatives, control requires no force. People believed they were choosing endurance. In reality, endurance had been chosen for them long before. This is why medieval people did not experience their lives as stolen. Nothing had been taken suddenly. Everything had been shaped gradually. The system did not crush hope. It resized it. And a resized hope fits perfectly inside a controlled life. Language in medieval life did far more than allow people to communicate. It quietly shaped what could be thought, what could be questioned, and what could never be fully imagined. Control did not rely on silencing speech. It relied on shaping it. By narrowing the ways people explained the world to themselves, the system narrowed the world itself. Most medieval people lived within a limited linguistic environment. Vocabulary was practical, local, and repetitive. Words existed for duties, tasks, obligations, and roles. Words existed for endurance, patience, loyalty, and order. Language developed around what needed to be done and what needed to be maintained. This was not accidental. Language grows where attention is spent. What was missing mattered as much as what existed. Words for abstract alternatives were rare. Language for personal transformation, systemic critique, or radical change did not circulate widely. Without language, certain ideas remained unformed. And ideas that remain unformed cannot be challenged. Explanation followed habit. When asked why something was done a certain way, answers were simple and circular. Because this is how it has always been. Because it works. Because it must be done. These explanations closed thought rather than opened it. They did not invite follow-up. They ended conversation. Importantly, these explanations did not feel insufficient. They felt complete. Completeness discouraged curiosity. Curiosity thrives on gaps. Medieval explanations minimized gaps by framing the world as already settled. Language also framed limits as natural rather than imposed. People spoke of one's place, one's role, and one's duty as if these were properties like age or height, things a person simply had. This framing removed agency quietly. If a limit is natural, it cannot be argued with. When people encountered hardship, language guided interpretation. Suffering was described as fate, misfortune, or simply life. These explanations did not identify a system. They identified an experience. Experience can be endured. Systems invite challenge. By interpreting difficulty as universal rather than structured, language redirected frustration inward. People learned to manage themselves rather than question conditions. Emotional energy was spent on coping, not critique. Storytelling reinforced this further. Common narratives emphasized endurance rewarded over time, patience leading to stability, and disruption leading to ruin. Characters who accepted their roles were portrayed as wise. Characters who resisted them were portrayed as reckless. These stories were not propaganda in a modern sense. They were reflections of lived reality shaped into moral lessons. Over time, these lessons became explanatory frameworks. When someone felt constrained, they interpreted that feeling through familiar stories. Constraint became character building rather than questionable. Endurance became virtue. Language also shaped memory. People remembered their lives in terms of duties fulfilled rather than choices made. When recounting the past, they described what they had done because it was required, not what they had wanted. Memory framed identity as obligation rather than intention. This mattered deeply. Identity anchored in obligation resists change. To change would mean to become someone else entirely. For most people, that felt dangerous rather than liberating. Even internal dialogue followed these linguistic patterns. When people thought to themselves, they used the same words they heard around them. Self-explanation mirrored communal explanation. This alignment made dissent difficult even in private thought. People rarely said, even to themselves, "I am limited." They said, "This is how life is." The difference is subtle but decisive. One implies constraint. The other implies inevitability. Language also controlled aspiration. When people spoke of the future, they used conditional, cautious phrasing. If things go well. If we are fortunate. These phrases framed improvement as luck rather than change. Planning beyond that felt unrealistic. When someone expressed a desire that extended beyond accepted boundaries, language corrected them gently. Others responded with phrases that softened and redirected. Be patient. That is not for everyone. Better not to risk it. These responses were not hostile. They were protective. Protection reinforced control. Importantly, medieval people did not experience this as suppression. They experienced it as wisdom being passed down. Elders spoke with authority earned through survival. Questioning that authority felt foolish. Even education, where it existed, reinforced explanation rather than inquiry. Learning focused on memorization, repetition, and accepted interpretation. Knowledge was something inherited, not discovered. Discovery implied novelty. Novelty implied risk. The structure of language ensured that questions dissolved into answers that led nowhere. Why did things work this way? Because they always had. Why had they always been this way? Because that was the order of things. The circle closed smoothly. This circularity was comforting. It reduced uncertainty. In a precarious world, certainty was valuable. People preferred explanations that stabilized rather than unsettled. As a result, the limits of life felt explained rather than enforced. People accepted them not because they were coerced, but because they made sense within the available language. Over generations, this linguistic environment reproduced itself. Children learned to speak within it. Their questions were shaped by it. Their answers returned them to it. The system did not need to silence alternative explanations. It only needed to ensure they never formed clearly enough to spread. This is why medieval people did not know their lives were being controlled. Control did not speak in commands. It spoke in explanations. Explanations that felt reasonable. Explanations that felt complete. When a system explains itself convincingly, resistance feels unnecessary. And when resistance feels unnecessary, control becomes invisible. Belief in medieval life did not function as a set of explicit doctrines that people consciously evaluated. It functioned as an interpretive framework. It explained why things happened, why suffering existed, why effort mattered, and why endurance was necessary. Most importantly, it explained why limits should be accepted rather than challenged. Meaning was not something individuals constructed freely. It was inherited. From childhood onward, people were taught how to interpret events, emotions, and outcomes. These interpretations did not arise spontaneously. They were learned through language, repetition, and communal response. When hardship occurred, belief supplied explanation immediately. Difficulty was not framed as a signal of systemic failure. It was framed as a test, a condition of existence, or an unavoidable part of life. These explanations mattered because they prevented the formation of alternative interpretations. If suffering has a reason that does not involve structure, structure remains unquestioned. This interpretive process was automatic. People did not stop to analyze why they believed what they believed. They simply reached for familiar explanations because those explanations were readily available. Availability creates credibility. What is easily accessed feels true. Meaning also shaped emotional response. Certain feelings were encouraged, others discouraged. Patience was praised. Acceptance was admired. Restlessness was viewed with suspicion. Desire for radical change was interpreted as immaturity rather than insight. This emotional regulation reinforced control quietly. People learned not only how to act, but how to feel about their actions. Feeling aligned mattered more than feeling satisfied. Internal harmony replaced external possibility. Language played a critical role here. Words carried judgment. To describe oneself as content was positive. To describe oneself as unsettled was negative. These linguistic associations guided self-evaluation. People learned to interpret discomfort as a personal failing rather than a structural signal. Belief systems also reframed time. Endurance was presented as meaningful because it extended across a lifetime. A difficult present was justified by a future that did not need to be defined clearly. Vague hope was more useful than concrete alternatives. It kept people moving without giving them direction. This vagueness mattered. When hope lacks specificity, it cannot be tested. It cannot fail. It sustains endurance without threatening stability. People were encouraged to trust that things had meaning without demanding to know how that meaning would manifest. Interpretation extended into success as well. When someone prospered, belief explained it as reward for alignment rather than as evidence of opportunity. This reinforced the idea that the system worked. Those who struggled blamed themselves rather than questioning structure. Over time, this created a moral hierarchy that aligned perfectly with control. Good outcomes validated obedience. Bad outcomes justified further endurance. There was no interpretive space left for critique. Belief also shaped social judgment. People evaluated others not by whether they questioned limits, but by how well they accepted them. Those who endured quietly were respected. Those who expressed dissatisfaction openly were seen as unstable. This judgment discouraged dissent more effectively than punishment. Social meaning matters deeply in small communities. Being interpreted negatively threatened belonging. Belonging was survival. Even moments of private doubt were shaped by belief. When individuals felt constrained, they interpreted that feeling as weakness, impatience, or lack of gratitude. Self-criticism replaced systemic critique. This internalization completed the system. Control no longer needed to operate externally. People regulated themselves through meaning. Importantly, belief did not feel imposed. It felt comforting. It reduced uncertainty. It offered explanations in a world where uncertainty was dangerous. People clung to it not because they were deceived, but because it helped them survive psychologically. Meaning also filled the silence left by limited choice. When action was constrained, interpretation expanded. People learned to find significance in endurance itself. Surviving became meaningful even when thriving was impossible. This reframing prevented despair. It also prevented change. Over generations, belief and language reinforced each other. Explanations were repeated until they felt obvious. Obviousness replaced inquiry. Inquiry faded. The system did not require people to believe falsehoods. It required them to believe incomplete truths. Truths that explained experience without explaining structure. This incompleteness was crucial. It allowed life to feel meaningful without becoming negotiable. When meaning is provided, people stop searching for alternatives. When alternatives disappear, control becomes invisible. Medieval people did not know their lives were being controlled because their beliefs told them their lives already made sense. Sense is powerful. It calms. It stabilizes. It closes questions. And when questions close, control no longer needs to answer them. Authority in medieval life did not function the way modern people imagine power. It was not a constant presence issuing commands. It was not always loud, visible, or aggressive. In most cases, authority was quiet, intermittent, and strangely distant. And yet, it shaped behavior with remarkable consistency. This was possible because authority did not need to be present to be effective. It had already been absorbed into expectation. Most medieval people did not encounter authority daily in the form of direct orders. They encountered it indirectly, through assumption. They knew what was expected of them long before anyone needed to say it. This expectation shaped action more reliably than force ever could. Authority was layered. At the top, there were figures of power. But most people interacted primarily with authority as a concept, not a person. It existed in customs, roles, and social reactions. You did not need to see authority to feel it. You felt it when you considered doing something unusual and decided not to. Obedience felt voluntary because it was framed as reasonable. Medieval people were taught, through experience rather than instruction, that obedience maintained stability. Stability meant safety. Safety meant survival. Disobedience, by contrast, introduced uncertainty. Uncertainty was dangerous. This calculation did not require fear of punishment. It required memory. People remembered what happened when order broke down. Conflict disrupted work. Disruption threatened food, cooperation, and protection. Obedience preserved continuity. Authority also benefited from distance. Those at the top were often abstract figures in daily life. Their presence was symbolic rather than constant. This abstraction allowed authority to be interpreted rather than confronted. Interpretation softened resistance. When authority appeared directly, it was usually in moments of importance rather than routine. This made its presence feel significant rather than oppressive. Rare enforcement reinforced legitimacy. If authority intervened only occasionally, it felt justified when it did. Most control occurred through intermediaries. Community leaders, elders, and respected figures transmitted expectations. These figures were familiar. Their authority felt personal rather than imposed. Compliance felt cooperative rather than coerced. This interpersonal transmission mattered deeply. People obeyed not because they feared punishment, but because they did not want to disrupt relationships. Social cohesion mattered more than abstract freedom. Authority also aligned itself with moral language. Obedience was framed as virtue. Reliability, loyalty, and acceptance were praised. Resistance was framed as recklessness or immaturity. This moral framing shifted obedience from external demand to internal value. Once obedience becomes a value, it no longer feels like submission. It feels like integrity. Importantly, medieval authority rarely demanded enthusiasm. It demanded consistency. People were not required to believe passionately. They were required to behave predictably. Predictability sustained the system. Those who complied quietly were left alone. This reinforced obedience. The reward for compliance was absence of attention. Attention was risk. People learned quickly that being unnoticed was beneficial. This dynamic created a paradox. Authority appeared lenient because it did not intervene constantly. But this leniency made control stronger, not weaker. It encouraged people to regulate themselves. Self-regulation was the system's greatest success. People corrected their own behavior before correction was needed. They anticipated consequences without experiencing them directly. Anticipation replaced enforcement. Authority also benefited from fragmentation. No single figure represented all power. Responsibility was dispersed. This made resistance difficult. There was no clear target. Discontent dissolved into confusion rather than action. When people felt constrained, they did not think, authority is limiting me. They thought this is how things work. The difference is subtle, but critical. One interpretation invites resistance. The other invites acceptance. Authority also shaped aspiration. People did not aspire to challenge power. They aspired to function well within it. Advancement meant recognition, not transformation. Success meant stability, not autonomy. This alignment reduced conflict. It also eliminated alternatives. Crucially, medieval people did not feel powerless. They felt competent. They knew how to survive within the system. Competence created pride. Pride reinforced loyalty. Leaving the system, by contrast, meant losing competence. Outside familiar structures, skills lost value. Obedience preserved mastery. Resistance threatened it. Authority also controlled through unpredictability. Rules were not always applied consistently. This inconsistency discouraged testing limits. When outcomes are unclear, people choose caution. But this unpredictability was not chaotic. It existed within accepted boundaries. People learned which behaviors were safe and which were not. They navigated authority carefully, not rebelliously. The system did not eliminate agency. It redirected it. Agency focused on navigating within limits rather than challenging them. This gave people a sense of control without threatening structure. Over time, obedience became invisible because it felt like choice. People believed they were acting freely because no one was forcing them in the moment. They did not see the long process that had shaped their preferences. This is the most effective form of authority. When people obey without feeling commanded, power no longer needs to assert itself. Medieval people did not think of themselves as oppressed. They thought of themselves as realistic. Realism meant accepting what could not be changed. Authority thrived on this realism. It did not need to convince people that authority was right. It only needed to convince them that alternatives were unrealistic. And once alternatives disappear from imagination, obedience feels natural. This is why medieval people did not know their lives were being controlled. Authority did not shout. It whispered. And over time, people learned to whisper it to themselves. Fear in medieval life did not operate as constant threat. It did not hover openly over every decision. It did not announce itself daily. Instead, fear existed as background knowledge, something remembered rather than experienced, something anticipated rather than encountered. This difference mattered. Fear that is constant becomes exhausting. Fear that is occasional becomes instructive. The medieval system relied on example far more than enforcement. Most people did not learn the limits of acceptable behavior by crossing them personally. They learned by watching what happened when someone else did. These moments were rare enough to stand out, but common enough to be remembered. When a response occurred, it was not necessarily dramatic. Often it was subtle: loss of trust, withdrawal of cooperation, reduced opportunity. These consequences were visible, socially legible, and enduring. They taught a lesson without needing repetition. Example worked because medieval communities were small and memory was long. People remembered outcomes. They told stories. They referenced them quietly. A single visible consequence could influence behavior for years. Fear did not need to be renewed constantly. It only needed to be credible. This credibility depended on uncertainty. People did not know exactly where the line was, only that crossing it carried risk. Uncertainty discourages experimentation. When outcomes are unclear, caution becomes the default. The system did not need to respond to every deviation. Responding selectively increased impact. If consequences appeared automatic, they would blend into routine. When they appeared selective, they commanded attention. Importantly, consequences were framed as responses to behavior, not expressions of power. This framing preserved legitimacy. It suggested that outcomes were natural results rather than imposed decisions. People learned to interpret consequences as inevitable rather than avoidable. Fear therefore attached itself to cause and effect rather than authority. People did not fear rulers. They feared disruption. Disruption triggered consequences. Avoiding disruption became wisdom. Example also worked through proximity. People did not observe distant outcomes. They observed neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances. Seeing someone familiar experience consequence made the lesson personal. It bridged the gap between abstract rule and lived reality. Over time, This observation created a shared mental map of boundaries. People did not need written rules. They carried examples in memory. Memory replaced instruction. This made the system efficient. It did not require constant oversight. People regulated themselves by referencing what they had seen before. Self-regulation reduced the need for direct intervention. Fear also worked indirectly through anticipation. People imagined consequences before acting. Imagination replaced experience. The mind completed the lesson without requiring repetition. Because of this, fear rarely escalated. It did not need to. The mere possibility of consequence was sufficient. Possibility is often more powerful than certainty. The system also benefited from variability. Not every deviation led to the same outcome. This variability prevented calculation. When rules are predictable, people test them. When outcomes vary, people avoid risk entirely. Importantly, fear was not presented as terror. It was presented as prudence. Avoiding risk was framed as intelligence. Those who acted cautiously were admired. Those who tested limits were viewed as foolish rather than brave. This cultural framing mattered deeply. When caution is admired, restraint becomes a value. Values operate internally. They require no enforcement. Fear was also buffered by belonging. People who complied felt protected. Protection reduced anxiety. This created a positive feedback loop. Compliance led to safety. Safety reinforced compliance. Those who deviated felt exposed. Exposure increased vulnerability. Vulnerability reinforced conformity. The system did not need to threaten. It only needed to remove protection selectively. Over time, fear became diffused. It was no longer associated with specific actions. It became a general sense of better not. This generalized caution shaped behavior broadly. This diffusion made fear less noticeable. People did not feel afraid. They felt sensible. Sensibility is comfortable. It feels like choice rather than constraint. Example also shaped aspiration. People learned what kinds of ambition were acceptable by observing outcomes. Ambition that aligned with existing roles was rewarded. Ambition that challenged structure carried risk. Over time, people aimed where reward was visible. Failure reinforced the lesson. When someone struggled after stepping outside accepted boundaries, their struggle was interpreted as evidence that deviation was unwise. Structural factors disappeared behind narrative. The system remained unquestioned. Importantly, medieval people did not believe consequences were arbitrary. They believed they were deserved. This belief transformed fear into morality. When consequence feels deserved, it does not feel oppressive. Moralization completed the system. People judged themselves before others did. They felt guilt or shame at the thought of deviation. Internal judgment replaced external enforcement. This internalization made fear nearly invisible. People no longer felt watched. They felt aligned. Alignment felt safe. The system also limited escalation by allowing small deviations. Minor differences were tolerated. This tolerance reduced pressure. It made the boundaries feel flexible. But flexibility existed only within safe zones. Beyond them, uncertainty returned. This combination of tolerance and uncertainty was powerful. It allowed individuality without threatening structure. People felt free enough not to resist, but constrained enough not to change. Fear also attached itself to time. Consequences were not always immediate. Delayed outcomes created lingering caution. People learned that deviation could surface later, unexpectedly. This temporal uncertainty discouraged risk. Stories reinforced this effect. People spoke quietly about what happened eventually. Eventually mattered more than immediately. It suggested that the system always balanced itself. Because fear was spread across memory, imagination, culture, and morality, it did not feel like fear. It felt like wisdom accumulated over generations. This is why medieval control did not require frequent punishment. Punishment was inefficient. Example was sufficient. Memory did the rest. People did not need to be reminded daily of limits. They carried limits within them. And when limits live inside people, control no longer needs to act. Medieval people did not feel intimidated. They felt informed. Informed about what not to do. Informed about what was wise. Informed about what was realistic. Fear, in this form, did not paralyze. It guided. Guidance feels helpful. Helpful systems are not resisted. This is the final refinement of authority. When fear teaches rather than threatens, obedience feels voluntary. And when obedience feels voluntary, control becomes invisible. At a certain point in medieval life, control no longer needed to shape behavior, belief, fear, time, language, or movement. All of those layers had already done their work. What remained was identity. And identity was the most complete form of control imaginable, because once a person understands themselves in a particular way, they no longer need to be managed from the outside. Medieval people did not think of identity as something flexible or chosen. Identity was not discovered. It was assumed. A person did not ask who they were meant to become. They learned who they already were. This learning did not happen through instruction. It happened through repetition, recognition, and reinforcement. From early life, individuals were identified by role before they were identified by personality. A child was seen as a future worker, a future provider, a future continuation of what already existed. Praise followed alignment with expectation. Correction followed deviation. Over time, identity formed around what was rewarded. This process felt natural. No one announced it. No one declared, "This is who you are." Instead, people felt approval when they behaved in expected ways. Approval felt good. Disapproval felt unsettling. The emotional response trained identity more effectively than rules ever could. As people aged, their sense of self narrowed around what they were good at, what they were known for, and what others expected of them. This narrowing felt like clarity. It felt like knowing one's place. Knowing one's place reduced anxiety. Uncertainty was replaced by definition. Definition is comforting. When identity is defined externally and absorbed internally, a person no longer feels lost. They feel grounded. Grounded people do not seek change. They seek stability. Importantly, identity in medieval life was collective rather than individual. A person understood themselves through relationships, family, occupation, community. The self did not exist in isolation. It existed as a function within a network. To change oneself meant disrupting that network. This interdependence made identity resistant to transformation. A person could not simply redefine themselves privately. Any change had social consequences. Those consequences affected others. Guilt discouraged deviation. Identity also absorbed obligation. What a person did was not just what they had to do. It was who they were. Work was not separate from self. A person did not perform labor. They embodied it. This made questioning labor equivalent to questioning self-worth. Over time, people internalized pride and endurance. Endurance became part of identity. Being able to tolerate hardship without complaint was admired. This admiration shaped self-perception. People measured themselves by how well they endured, not by how much they changed. Even dissatisfaction was filtered through identity. When someone felt constrained, they did not interpret it as misalignment between self and system. They interpreted it as personal inadequacy. I should be stronger. I should be more patient. Self-blame replaced systemic awareness. This internalization completed the system. Control no longer needed to act on people. People acted on themselves. Identity also limited imagination. People imagined futures that fit their sense of self. A person who identified as a certain role could not easily imagine becoming something else. Imagination obeyed identity. Stories reinforced this. Narratives celebrated people who fulfilled their roles faithfully. Identity was portrayed as destiny rather than option. Those who attempted to escape their assigned identities were portrayed as unstable or foolish. This narrative pressure mattered. People want coherence between their lives and the stories they tell about themselves. If the available stories reward acceptance, acceptance becomes self-justifying. Language again played a role. People described themselves using role-based terms rather than personal traits. Identity language emphasized function over feeling. When identity is functional, value is measured by usefulness, not fulfillment. This functional identity aligned perfectly with control. Useful people are predictable. Predictable people are manageable. Manageable people do not resist. Importantly, medieval people did not feel erased. They felt recognized. Recognition came from fulfilling expectations. Fulfillment produced belonging. Belonging satisfied deep psychological needs. Because identity was tied to belonging, leaving the system felt like losing selfhood. Outside the system, identity dissolved. Dissolution felt terrifying. Even imagining it caused anxiety. This is why control at the level of identity is so powerful. It does not require force. It requires consistency. Over years, consistency shapes self-understanding until alternatives feel impossible. People defended the system not because they benefited greatly from it, but because it defined them. Criticizing the system felt like criticizing themselves. Defensiveness replaced reflection. By the time a medieval person reached maturity, their identity aligned so closely with their role that separation was unthinkable. They did not feel trapped. They felt complete. Completeness is dangerous. A complete identity leaves no room for questioning. This is the final layer of medieval control. When people become what the system needs them to be, the system no longer needs to control them. They carry it inside themselves. They reproduce it through behavior, expectation, and teaching the next generation. They are not prisoners of the system. They are its continuation. And this is why medieval people did not know their lives were being controlled. By the time control reached identity, there was no longer anyone left to notice it. Once identity had been fully absorbed at the individual level, the system no longer relied on enforcement, explanation, or example alone. It relied on inheritance. Control survived not because it was defended consciously, but because it was passed down quietly, embedded in upbringing, expectation, and care. Each generation reproduced the system not as obedience, but as preparation. Parents did not teach children how to obey authority. They taught them how to survive. Survival required alignment. Alignment required acceptance. This transmission felt loving, responsible, and necessary. It was not framed as limitation. It was framed as guidance. From early childhood, children were shaped through imitation. They watched how adults carried themselves, how they spoke, how they reacted to difficulty. They learned which behaviors earned approval and which caused concern. These lessons were absorbed emotionally, not intellectually. Care itself became a vehicle of control. Parents corrected children not to suppress them, but to protect them. Don't do that. Stay here. Be careful. Each instruction carried genuine concern. But over time, concern merged with conformity. Safety became indistinguishable from obedience. This mattered deeply. When control is transmitted through care, resisting it feels like rejecting protection. Gratitude replaces critique. Children learn that alignment keeps them safe, while deviation worries those who love them. Expectation hardened early. Children were not asked what they wanted to become. They were guided toward what was realistic. Realistic meant familiar. Familiar meant proven. Proven meant safe. This chain of reasoning eliminated alternatives before they could be explored. Education, where present, reinforced repetition rather than discovery. Knowledge was inherited, not questioned. Authority was cited, not examined. Learning meant remembering what others had already decided. This framed knowledge as something external and settled. Even play reflected this structure. Games imitated adult roles. Imagination rehearsed reality rather than escaping it. Children practiced the identities they would later inhabit. Play did not disrupt the system. It trained it. As children grew, responsibility was introduced gradually. Each new responsibility reinforced identity. Praise followed competence. Competence reinforced belonging. Belonging anchored self-worth. By adolescence, identity felt earned rather than assigned. At this stage, control became self-reinforcing. Young people defended the system instinctively because it had rewarded them with recognition. Questioning it felt unnecessary and risky. Stories played a critical role in this transmission. Elders shared narratives that framed endurance as wisdom and stability as virtue. These stories were not imposed as doctrine. They were offered as experience. Experience carried authority. Failure stories mattered just as much. Tales of those who strayed, who sought too much, who disrupted order, circulated quietly. These stories did not condemn openly. They warned subtly. Warning shaped caution. This narrative environment ensured that identity remained narrow enough to be stable, but broad enough to feel meaningful. People could take pride in who they were without needing to imagine who they were not. Over generations, this process normalized limitation. What had once been adaptation became tradition. What had been necessity became morality. What had been survival became identity. Importantly, no generation experienced this as loss. Each generation inherited a complete world. Completeness masked constraint. When life feels whole, the absence of alternatives is invisible. Parents believed they were preparing children for reality, not reproducing control. This belief was sincere. The system relied on sincerity. Cynicism would have weakened it. Because the transmission was emotional rather than ideological, it resisted disruption. Ideas can be challenged. Habits and identities are harder to dislodge. By the time a person could think critically, their sense of self was already aligned. Even moments of crisis reinforced inheritance. During hardship, elders emphasized endurance and conformity as proven strategies. Crisis did not invite experimentation. It invited consolidation. This is why control persisted even when conditions changed slightly. The system did not need to adapt quickly. Identity slowed response. Stability was preserved at the cost of flexibility. Occasionally, individuals did feel misaligned. They sensed that something did not fit. But without language, example, or support, that feeling remained internal and vague. Vague discomfort rarely leads to action. Those who attempted to redefine themselves faced not just resistance, but confusion. Others did not know how to respond. The system lacked scripts for transformation, only for continuation. As a result, identity repaired itself. Deviations were absorbed or discarded. The structure remained intact. This generational reproduction explains why medieval control endured without constant force. Authority did not need to impose itself anew. Each generation renewed it willingly through upbringing. People did not pass down chains. They passed down instructions, habits, and care. The effect was the same. Control that is inherited feels natural. Natural things are rarely questioned. By the time medieval people reached adulthood, they did not experience identity as imposed. They experienced it as theirs. Ownership is powerful. People defend what they believe belongs to them. This is the quiet brilliance of the system. It did not demand loyalty. It produced it. It did not enforce identity. It cultivated it. And because identity was passed down as wisdom, not constraint, medieval people never learned to see it as control. They believed they were teaching their children how to live. In reality, they were teaching them how to remain. Cracks in medieval control did not appear as sudden awakenings or collective realizations. They appeared quietly, briefly, and often disappeared before they could fully form into understanding. Most medieval people never experienced a clear moment of realization in which they thought, "My life is being controlled." What they experienced instead were moments of discomfort that did not fit neatly into the explanations they had inherited. These moments did not feel like rebellion. They felt like confusion. A crack usually began with mismatch. Effort no longer produced expected stability. Endurance no longer resulted in security. A person followed the rules, fulfilled obligations, behaved correctly, and yet something still felt wrong. This dissonance was unsettling because the system had taught that proper behavior led to acceptable outcomes. When this connection weakened, people did not immediately question the structure. They questioned themselves. Had they failed somehow? Had they been insufficiently patient? Had they misunderstood their role? Self-doubt arrived long before systemic doubt. Cracks often appeared during periods of disruption, not because disruption caused awareness, but because it strained explanations. When familiar rhythms faltered, interpretation became harder. People struggled to fit new experiences into old meanings. The effort to reconcile them created tension. Yet, even in these moments, the system resisted exposure. Explanations expanded rather than broke. Hardship was framed as exceptional, temporary, a test rather than a pattern. These interpretations mattered because they preserved the belief that the structure itself remained sound. Cracks also appeared when people encountered difference. Travel, however limited, exposed individuals to alternative ways of living. Seeing different customs, different hierarchies, or different relationships between effort and outcome introduced comparison. Comparison is dangerous to control because it reveals contingency, but comparison was quickly neutralized. Difference was framed as strange, inferior, or unsuitable. That works there, but not here. This framing allowed observation without transformation. Curiosity was permitted without consequence. Another source of cracks was generational tension. Younger people occasionally sensed that the paths laid before them were narrower than those their elders had described. Elders spoke of survival as wisdom. The young experienced it as confinement. This difference created quiet friction. However, generational authority resolved this friction quickly. Elders were respected not because they were always right, but because they had endured. Endurance carried moral weight. Questioning it felt disrespectful. Respect closed cracks before they widened. Cracks also emerged in moments of personal loss or exhaustion. When endurance reached its limits, people felt anger, frustration, or despair that could not be easily explained away. These emotions hinted at misalignment between human need and structural demand. But emotion alone rarely produced insight. Without language to articulate systemic causes, feeling remained private and fleeting. Private feelings rarely change public systems. Importantly, cracks were isolating. People rarely shared them openly. Expressing doubt invited concern, redirection, or quiet correction. Social response softened dissent without addressing it. This discouraged collective awareness. Isolation mattered. A single person questioning silently does not threaten a system. Systems are challenged only when awareness becomes shared. Medieval control prevented sharing by framing doubt as personal rather than collective. Even when multiple people experienced similar discontent, they interpreted it individually. Each person believed their struggle was unique. Without shared language, patterns remained invisible. Occasionally, cracks widened briefly. Small disruptions exposed how fragile certain assumptions were. In these moments, people glimpsed the constructed nature of their lives. But these glimpses were unstable. They lacked reinforcement. The system responded not with suppression, but with restoration. Familiar routines resumed. Explanations reasserted themselves. Stability returned. Relief followed. Relief closed the crack. This cycle mattered. Relief reinforced the belief that disruption was temporary and structure was reliable. The system regained legitimacy precisely when it had been threatened. Cracks also appeared when authority made mistakes. Inconsistency exposed arbitrariness. People noticed unfairness. But unfairness was interpreted as failure of individuals, not of authority itself. Blame localized. Structure survived. This localization of blame was critical. It allowed anger without analysis. Anger exhausted itself quickly when it lacked direction. Cracks never lasted long enough to become insight because insight requires sustained reflection. Medieval life did not allow sustained reflection easily. Work, obligation, and survival resumed quickly. Reflection was crowded out. Even when people sensed that something was wrong, they lacked a destination for that realization. There was no clear alternative to imagine. Without alternative, awareness becomes discomfort rather than action. The system depended on this. It did not need to eliminate doubt entirely. It only needed to prevent doubt from becoming organized. Over time, people learned to distrust moments of questioning. These moments were associated with anxiety rather than clarity. Stability felt better. People returned to it willingly. This is why cracks in medieval control rarely led to transformation. The system was not brittle. It was flexible. It absorbed pressure without breaking. Control did not fail when cracks appeared. It adapted. It reframed. It soothed. It waited. Most importantly, medieval people did not interpret these cracks as revelations. They interpreted them as personal trials, temporary confusion, or signs of weakness. Interpretation neutralized potential insight. When awareness cannot be named, it cannot be shared. When it cannot be shared, it cannot grow. This is the final defense of invisible control. It allows people to feel discomfort without understanding it. Understanding is dangerous. Discomfort alone is manageable. Cracks appeared, but they closed. Not because the system was perfect, but because it was practiced. Practiced over generations. Practiced through care, habit, identity, and explanation. Medieval people did not live without moments of doubt. They lived without a way to turn doubt into freedom. And so the system endured. When cracks appeared in medieval life, the system did not rush to close them through force. It did not need to. The system relied on something far more reliable: exhaustion, isolation, and the absence of alternatives. These three elements ensured that even when people sensed something was wrong, that sensation could not mature into change. The first reason cracks never became transformation was exhaustion. Medieval life consumed nearly all available energy. Physical labor, constant obligation, and the fragility of survival left little reserve for sustained reflection. Insight requires energy. Questioning requires time. Both were scarce. A moment of awareness might arise in silence, at the end of a long day, or during a brief disruption. But awareness alone is not enough. To grow, it needs space. Medieval life closed that space quickly. The next task arrived. The next obligation demanded attention. Awareness faded under necessity. Exhaustion did more than limit thought. It shaped priorities. When survival is uncertain, immediate needs outweigh abstract concerns. Even if a person sensed structural unfairness, Addressing it felt secondary to feeding a family or maintaining cooperation. Structural critique offered no immediate solution. The system benefited from this prioritization. It did not suppress thought directly. It crowded it out. Crowding is quieter than censorship and more effective. The second reason cracks never matured was isolation. Awareness was experienced privately. People did not know others felt the same. Without shared recognition, doubt remained personal. Personal doubt feels like weakness. Shared doubt feels like truth. Medieval control ensured that doubt remained personal. There were no safe spaces for collective questioning. Public expression invited concern or correction. Private expression had no echo. Without echo, insight dissolves. People might feel frustration, anger, or sadness, but they interpreted these emotions individually. Something is wrong with me. I am failing. This interpretation prevented pattern recognition. Patterns threaten systems. Individual stories do not. Even when multiple people experience similar cracks, they lack the language to connect them. Language shapes awareness. Without words to describe systemic control, feelings remained vague. Vague feelings do not mobilize. The third reason cracks closed was the absence of credible alternatives. Awareness without alternatives leads to paralysis, not action. Medieval people could not easily imagine a different structure of life. There were no visible models to point to, no proven paths to follow. When alternatives are unclear, change feels like destruction rather than creation. Destruction is frightening in a fragile world. Stability, even when uncomfortable, feels safer than unknown possibility. This absence of alternatives made the system appear inevitable. Inevitable systems are rarely challenged. They are endured. Even when people sensed that life could be different, they lacked confidence that difference would be better. Stories warned against deviation. Examples of failure were remembered more vividly than rare successes. Memory favored caution. The system also benefited from emotional regulation. People were taught to interpret dissatisfaction as impatience. Patience was praised. Impatience was criticized. Emotional framing discouraged sustained discontent. Over time, people learned to distrust moments of questioning. Questioning produced anxiety, not relief. Stability produced calm. The mind naturally returned to what felt calmer. This emotional feedback loop mattered deeply. Control does not require agreement. It requires preference. People preferred stability because it reduced anxiety. That preference kept the system intact. Another factor was responsibility. Adults carried obligations that extended beyond themselves. Families depended on them. Communities relied on them. Risking stability felt selfish. Moral framing suppressed experimentation. When responsibility is shared, individual resistance feels harmful. This moral weight silenced doubt more effectively than fear. The system also neutralized cracks through explanation. When something went wrong, explanations were ready. Misfortune, fate, poor judgment, temporary disruption. These explanations absorbed discomfort. They prevented it from pointing outward. Importantly, explanations were comforting. They restored meaning. Meaning reduces distress. People accepted explanations not because they were convinced, but because they were soothing. Control thrived on this soothing quality. A system that comforts will always outlast one that threatens. Cracks also failed to persist because time itself worked against them. Disruptions were temporary. Routines returned. Familiarity reasserted itself. Normalcy felt reassuring. Reassurance closed questions. Each time a crack closed without consequence, the system gained credibility. Things work out. The structure holds. This belief deepened trust. Trust is dangerous to freedom. Trusted systems are not examined closely. Even authority mistakes did not destabilize the structure. Blame localized. Individuals were faulted. The system remained abstract and intact. Abstract systems are difficult to challenge. Over generations, this pattern repeated. Cracks appeared. Cracks closed. The memory of discomfort faded. The structure endured. Importantly, medieval people were not passive victims. They adapted intelligently. Adaptation ensured survival. But adaptation also ensured continuity. Continuity preserved control. The system did not need people to believe it was perfect. It only needed them to believe it was unavoidable. And avoidance of the unavoidable feels pointless. This is why medieval control rarely faced sustained resistance. Not because people were unaware, but because awareness lacked support, energy, language, and alternatives. Awareness without leverage is fragile. The system understood this intuitively. It did not eliminate awareness. It made awareness unproductive. Unproductive awareness returns to silence. By the time a person might have tried to act on a crack, life had already moved on. The moment passed. The structure remained. This is the final strength of medieval control. It did not crush dissent. It waited for it to exhaust itself. And because it waited patiently, it survived. Medieval people did not fail to change their world because they lacked intelligence or courage. They failed because the world they lived in did not allow insight to become movement. And without movement, even the clearest crack eventually closes. Medieval people did not wake up each morning thinking their lives were being directed by an unseen system. They woke up thinking they were simply living. That is what made the control so complete. It did not arrive as force, commands, or constant punishment. It arrived as habit, as expectation, as identity, as care passed from one generation to the next. Nothing was taken from them suddenly. Instead, possibilities were never fully offered. Time shaped them before choice could form. Language explained limits until limits felt natural. Work filled their days until reflection felt impractical. Fear taught caution without needing terror. Authority became background noise rather than confrontation. Identity itself became the final lock, turning people into willing continuations of the system that shaped them. They did not resist because resistance required energy, language, alternatives, and collective awareness. All things medieval life quietly drained away. When cracks appeared, they were isolated, soothed, or exhausted back into silence. Not because people were incapable of seeing, but because seeing alone was never enough. This is why medieval people didn't know their lives were being controlled. Control never announced itself. It felt like common sense. It felt like realism. It felt like survival. And that is the most unsettling part. A system does not need cruelty to endure. It only needs to feel inevitable. Thank you for staying until the end and taking this journey through quiet, everyday history. If you enjoyed this deep, realistic look at how ordinary lives were shaped without people noticing, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep these long, thoughtful stories alive. And remember, the most powerful forms of control are the ones that never have to say your name.